1941, two rival empires that distrusted each other more than almost anyone else on Earth did something extraordinary. They agreed to invade a neutral country together. For 20 years, Reza Shah Pahlavi had tried to protect Iran with a strategy he called the Third Force. It was a careful balancing act in a dangerous neighborhood. Britain dominated the Persian Gulf and controlled much of the region's oil industry to the south. To the north stood the Soviet Union, the successor to the Russian Empire that had intervened repeatedly in Iranian affairs for more than a century. Both powers had occupied Iranian territory before. Both had dictated terms to Iranian governments. Reza Shah believed the only way to escape that pattern was to bring in a third partner, one powerful enough to counterbalance both of them, but distant enough not to dominate the country directly. He chose Germany. German engineers helped build factories and railways. German technicians trained Iranian mechanics and industrial workers. German companies supplied machinery and expertise for modernization projects that Reza Shah saw as the foundation of a new, independent state. By the late 1930s, Germany had become Iran's largest non-oil trading partner. To Reza Shah, this relationship represented leverage. It allowed him to signal to London and Moscow that Iran had alternatives. If either power attempted to dominate the country, Tehran could simply shift its economic and diplomatic relationships elsewhere. For years, the strategy seemed to work. Iran remained independent. The government pushed forward with ambitious modernization programs, new railways, factories, schools, and a rapidly expanding army. But the strategy depended on one fragile assumption, that the balance of power between the great empires would remain relatively stable. On June 22, 1941, that assumption shattered. Early that morning, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Nearly 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border. Thousands of tanks and aircraft smashed through Soviet defenses. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed in the opening weeks of the campaign. Cities fell one after another. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, each defeat pushing the German advance deeper into Soviet territory. For a moment, it looked as though the Soviet Union itself might collapse. But the consequences of Barbarossa did not stop at the front lines. The shockwave spread outward across continents and into regions that had not yet fired a single shot. One of those regions was Iran. The relationship with Germany that had once helped balance British and Soviet influence now looked completely different to Allied strategists. German technicians and advisors working inside Iran were suddenly viewed through the lens of wartime suspicion. In British intelligence reports, they began to appear less like engineers and more like potential agents of the German state. There were fears that Abwehr operatives, members of Germany's military intelligence service, might be operating inside the country under civilian cover. Some reports claimed that German specialists had mapped critical infrastructure, oil pipelines, rail lines, telegraph networks, and port facilities. British officials worried that Germany might attempt sabotage operations or even airborne raids targeting the massive oil refinery at Abadan, the largest refinery on Earth at the time and a cornerstone of Britain's naval fuel supply. Historians still debate how serious these threats really were. Many of the Germans living in Iran were exactly what they appeared to be: contracted specialists, teachers, and technicians working on civilian projects. But in the atmosphere of total war, suspicion carried enormous weight, and the strategic importance of Iran meant that Allied leaders were unwilling to take risks. To Britain, the stakes were obvious. The Abadan Refinery produced enormous quantities of fuel for the Royal Navy. British global power depended heavily on maritime strength, and maritime strength depended on oil. If that supply were disrupted, the consequences could ripple across the entire British war effort. For the Soviet Union, the situation was even more urgent. After Barbarossa, Soviet logistics were in crisis. The Red Army needed trucks, locomotives, ammunition, food, and raw materials on a scale its own devastated economy could no longer provide. Increasingly, those supplies were coming from the United States through the Lend-Lease program, but getting them into the Soviet Union was a logistical nightmare. Arctic convoys sailing to northern Soviet ports faced constant attacks from German submarines and aircraft. Losses were heavy, and winter storms made the route dangerous even without enemy action. Western routes through Europe were completely blocked by the German army. That left only one viable path, a corridor through Iran. Ships could unload supplies at ports along the Persian Gulf. From there, trains and truck convoys could carry the cargo north across Iranian territory into the Soviet Union. At the heart of that system stood the Trans-Iranian Railway, an engineering project that had taken years of labor and enormous financial investment to complete. For Reza Shah, the railway had symbolized national independence and modernization. Now it had become a critical artery for the Allied war effort. Iran was no longer simply a neutral country. It had become strategic territory. By July 1941, diplomatic pressure began to intensify. British and Soviet diplomats delivered an ultimatum to Tehran, demanding the immediate expulsion of all German nationals from the country. They argued that these individuals represented a Nazi fifth column, a hidden network capable of sabotaging oil facilities, transportation networks, and military supply routes. Reza Shah rejected the accusation. From his perspective, the Germans were not spies. They were specialists who kept Iranian industry functioning and modernization projects moving forward. Expelling them would cripple the very programs he had spent years building. Still, he attempted a partial compromise, agreeing to reduce their numbers. But by this point, Allied leaders had already concluded that compromise would not solve the problem. From London, Winston Churchill viewed the situation through the harsh logic of wartime strategy. Britain could not risk losing access to Iranian oil or the Persian Corridor. From Moscow, Joseph Stalin viewed the issue even more bluntly. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. Millions of soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front. Any potential vulnerability near the southern border of the USSR was intolerable. A second ultimatum followed. This time, the message was unmistakable. Iran's Prime Minister, Ali Mansour, recognized the danger immediately. The diplomatic language of the notes concealed a military reality. Invasion preparations were already underway. But Reza Shah hesitated. He believed Britain would hesitate to violate the sovereignty of a neutral country. He believed that international law still imposed limits on wartime behavior. The brutal logic of total war had already erased those limits. At dawn on August 25, 1941, the invasion began. From the north, Soviet forces crossed the border into Iranian Azerbaijan. Armored divisions pushed southward while aircraft struck military installations and transportation hubs. From the west and south, British and Indian forces advanced from Iraq and the Persian Gulf. The operation was known as Operation Countenance. The Iranian military, despite years of expansion, was unprepared for the scale and coordination of the attack. Reza Shah had built a large army, but its internal structure was fragile. Command authority was tightly centralized around the Shah himself. Senior officers were deliberately prevented from building independent power bases in order to reduce the risk of coups. In peacetime, that strategy preserved the ruler's authority. In wartime, it crippled the military. Communication lines collapsed almost immediately. Units lost contact with central command. Orders failed to reach frontline formations. Iranian aircraft were destroyed on their airfields before pilots could scramble into the air. In the south, the Iranian Navy attempted to resist British naval forces along the Karun River. Admiral Gholam Ali Bayandur refused to surrender and directed the defense personally. He was killed during the fighting, becoming one of the few figures remembered for open resistance during the invasion. Elsewhere, Iranian troops found themselves overwhelmed by Allied air superiority and mechanized forces. Cities such as Tabriz, Rasht, and Ardabil were struck by Soviet air raids that spread panic through both military units and civilian populations. Within less than a week, organized Iranian resistance had collapsed. By August 30th, the government requested a ceasefire. Within weeks, Allied forces effectively controlled the country. 16 years of military modernization had been neutralized in a matter of days. Yet the invasion had never been purely about defeating the Iranian army. The Allies wanted political stability as well, and that meant removing Reza Shah. To Allied leaders, he had become a liability, too independent, too resistant to pressure, and too closely associated with Germany. A propaganda campaign began almost immediately. BBC Persian broadcasts criticized his rule, portraying him as corrupt and authoritarian. These messages spread quickly through urban populations already frustrated by years of heavy-handed reforms and centralized power. But the greatest blow to Reza Shah's authority came not from foreign broadcasts, but from domestic silence. The clergy, angered by his secularization policies, did not defend him. Merchants in the bazaars, who had long resented government interference in trade, did not mobilize in his support. Tribal leaders who had been crushed by his army remained passive observers. Reza Shah had built a powerful state, but he had not built widespread loyalty. On September 16, 1941, he abdicated the throne. Power passed to his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a young monarch suddenly responsible for governing a country occupied by foreign armies. The former Shah was forced into exile. He was sent first to Mauritius and later to South Africa, where he died in Johannesburg in 1944. Meanwhile, Iran itself was transformed into something entirely different, a logistical corridor. Railways, roads, and ports were reorganized to serve the needs of the Allied war effort. Massive convoys of trucks transported supplies from Persian Gulf ports northward through the mountains toward the Soviet frontier. Over the next 4 years, more than 5 million tons of Allied material moved through Iran. Vehicles, tanks, aircraft components, fuel, food supplies, and industrial equipment. The route became known as the Persian Corridor. Without it, the Soviet war effort might have faced catastrophic shortages. Yet for the Iranian population living along this corridor, the occupation produced severe economic disruption. Transportation networks that once moved food across the country were redirected toward military logistics. Trucks and trains were commandeered by Allied authorities. Inflation surged as foreign forces introduced large quantities of currency into local economies while consumer goods remained scarce. Food distribution systems broke down. Bread became difficult to obtain in many cities. Riots erupted in Tehran as desperate crowds gathered outside bakeries. The crisis deepened in 1942 and 1943, when poor harvests and transportation shortages combined with wartime inflation. The resulting famine became one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern Iranian history. Hundreds of thousands of people died from starvation and disease. Typhus spread rapidly through weakened populations and crowded urban areas. The contrast between wartime logistics and civilian suffering was stark. In the compounds and supply depots used by Allied officers, food remained available. Outside those facilities, hungry civilians gathered at fences, hoping for scraps. Even as Iran struggled under occupation, its capital suddenly became the center of global diplomacy. In November 1943, the leaders of the Allied world, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, met in Tehran. It was the first time the three men had met together in person. Their discussions would shape the final strategy for defeating Nazi Germany, including plans for the massive invasion of Western Europe that would become D-Day. Yet Iran itself had almost no role in these historic decisions. The young Shah was not invited to the main conference sessions. Instead, he held brief individual meetings with the visiting leaders. Roosevelt met him for a short conversation. Churchill was polite but distant. Stalin made a dramatic symbolic gesture by visiting the Shah at his palace. Behind the scenes, however, Stalin's strategic calculations extended beyond the war itself. He was already considering Soviet influence in northern Iran and the possibility of securing post-war oil concessions. The conference concluded with a Tehran declaration. In it, the Allied leaders promised to respect Iran's independence and territorial integrity after the war. But once the war ended, that promise would face an immediate test. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. British and American forces soon began withdrawing from Iranian territory, as previously agreed. Soviet forces did not. Instead, they remained in northern Iran and supported the establishment of two separatist regimes, the Azerbaijan People's Government in Tabriz and the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad. The move triggered one of the first major confrontations of the emerging Cold War. Iran appealed to the newly created United Nations Security Council, making the dispute one of the first international crises debated by the organization. At the same time, Prime Minister Ahmad Kavam traveled to Moscow to negotiate directly with Stalin. The negotiations were tense and complex. Kavam offered the possibility of Soviet participation in future oil development in northern Iran in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet troops. Stalin agreed to the arrangement. In 1946, Soviet forces finally withdrew from Iranian territory. But once Iranian authority was restored, the Iranian parliament refused to ratify the oil agreement. It was a bold diplomatic maneuver. Iran had forced one of the world's most powerful states to remove its troops without firing a shot. Yet the memory of occupation and foreign interference remained deeply embedded in Iranian political consciousness. The invasion of 1941 had shattered illusions about neutrality and sovereignty. A generation of Iranians had watched their country invaded, their ruler exiled, and their resources turned into instruments of a global war. They had seen foreign leaders gather in their capital to decide the future of the world, while ordinary Iranians struggled to survive. Those memories would shape Iranian politics for decades. Out of that experience emerged a powerful new form of nationalism, focused on reclaiming control of the country's economic resources. At the center of that movement stood an unlikely figure. Not a soldier, not a king, but a lawyer who believed sovereignty could be defended through law and democratic politics. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and he was about to challenge one of the most powerful economic empires on earth. He was going to take Iran's oil back, and the struggle that followed would transform the Middle East.